So without further ado, please welcome on stage Dominique Feyer. Bienvenue.
Woo, 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 woo. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, it's pretty hard to do that talk just after the zebras, and I want to say that I really love zebras. My talk is about Htmx. That part of the talk is about Htmx. And the first part of the talk is about the history of web development. Where did we come from, and why are we here today? And if it works, yeah, it works. I tend to see this kind of really extremely short discussion happening in many different projects. So the client just say, I need some interactivity, and there is someone in the room that is building a Frankenstein build chain and preparing React for the next release. That's not wrong, maybe, but that's maybe a bit too early in the project to take the decision. Between the client request and that developer solution, there is a lot of room for a long discussion. And from this discussion, we can then take a better decision on what kind of tooling did we need. Did we really need to include that huge framework into the system to maybe solve some quite common issue? So that's really something that's in my mind since a long time. And I recently found Htmx, who is the successor of another project named Intercooler.js. So it's not a young project. It's here since a long time. But what I found really interesting is that Carlson Gross, who is the daddy of Htmx and Intercooler, is smart enough to think a bit out of the box. If you compare most modern frameworks, they mostly work exactly the same way. There is no really innovation. There is like difference between React and Vue and Svelte and stuff, and there is some slight advantage in some case. But basically, it's the exact same way of thinking. And I was really like refreshed to see, oh, that guy spent nearly a decade of thinking, can we make front-end differently? So let's do a bit of history. I'm quite old, so let's go back 30 years ago. Internet was invented not too far away from my home. I was a kid like this, not too far from Geneva. And basically, you just have to write some simple HTML, make some table, put your content inside, found some nice place to host it. And then every request, you just copy that HTML file to the browser. And that was it. That was the intention of Internet. Making transportation of text and Hypermedia information easy and quick. And that was easy and quick. Nobody speak about, can we do a better performance for our little HTML file? That was not a subject. Then mid-90s, internet is a bit more trendy. Some different vendors start to say, oh, it could be nice to have the control of the browser. And then Netscape, Internet Explorer, and many of you can remember that beautiful gold age of discrepancy and inconsistency between browsers. That was a bit less fun. In the late 90s, something really nice happened up here. Before that, we just used like huge table with sliced image to make some really nice layout. That was crazy. And then CSS appeared. And we can make a difference between what is responsible to transport data, content, and what is responsible to transport presentation, styling, And that was great, because at this point, HTML started to be a really good way of transporting content without really being attached to presentation. And by the way, at the previous slide, late 90s, or yeah, it was late 90s, there is PHP 1.0 that just popped up. So there is now a change in the backend. You can host something else than just your HTML. You can build your HTML from a database, from some flat files, and then push them to the client. And then something new appeared, XML HTTP request API. And it was not working exactly how we think that it should work. It was so hard to make a request to the because browser vendor didn't read the spec correctly, or they maybe read it too fast. And then jQuery appeared. And jQuery basically solved the problem that browser vendor created just before. It just makes HTTP request usable for a normal human. That was quite interesting. And we can start to have more and more JavaScript on the front end, and we can start to discuss with the backend to exchange some data, send some response, get some new data to update some part of the page. But we don't have any standard way of doing it. We have this nice jQuery object, and everybody can do whatever they want. And then, another really interesting period, 2010, the Cambrian explosion of front-end web framework. The Cambrian explosion is a really old area for our Earth where life diversity just exploded. It was like a few million years, and life creates so many diversity inside life. That's really an amazing period. And I think that's exactly what happened to web frontend. We just have 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and version 2 or version 1 that just, and it's incompatible and stuff. And but it gives a lot of power to the front end. It was super interesting. You can build some really interactive UI, but it also opens there is some bad side of that. And for me, one first backside is between the backend and the front end, you can trust your backend 99% of the time. You cannot trust your front end 99% of the time. What happened in the front end didn't happen on your own computer. You are not even sure that it's your own code that is currently running on the front end. So there is really like a security difference. One part is trustable, the other part is not trustable. So every bit of data that you receive from your front end, it's not your data. They need to be validated, check it, double check it, to not have an issue. Oh, next one. Yeah. So here we go. I think Robert speak about complexity this morning. I heard the word complexity also on the Hello Soak of David earlier today. And I have really a love and hate relationship with complexity. I think I choose to study physics because I love complexity. I really enjoy. It's beautiful to be able to understand complexity, to understand how things work. That can be for a mechanical challenge, that can be for a domain-specific features. Complexity is really, really great. And at the same time, I hate complexity. And I found my own self adding more complexity in front of me just for the sake of, I don't know, complexity. And I think this is bad complexity. When I make my own life harder, I think I didn't behave correctly. And there is this amazing quote. I don't know if you know from who say that. Any idea? Yes, yes, this is Einstein. And I think he is totally, this is amazing. It's so easy. Adding more complexity requires no reflection. Removing complexity, when you see the history of web development, you can observe that complexity just stack up on top of the previous level of complexity. It's not like just a new complexity. It's one more layer of complexity on top of the level of complexity that you have before. And we do the same thing with, by example, public regulation. We have a huge amount of rules, and it's super hard to change the existing rules. And it's super easy to create new rules on top of what we have. So because we are kind of a lazy animal, and we really enjoy like saving our energy, we tend to add more complexity because we don't want to spend the time required to go to the simplicity. And it will cost more time to go to the complexity for sure. One thing that happens when you start to split the backend and the front end, it's state explosion. This is Web 1.0, you have your backend, this is the source of truth, the only source of truth. You just build some HTML and send it to the front end. That's it. When you build your HTML, you have all the knowledge and the fresh knowledge required to build the HTML. You don't have any open question. What you have, it's the source of truth. And then Web 2. Your backend is still your real source of truth. But you have JavaScript on the front end. So you need to send some JSON files with, by the way, a state. It's part of the backend state that you transfer to JavaScript. And then JavaScript received this little JSON, which didn't really match what you need to do in the front end. So you do a derivation of that JSON file, and it becomes the third state, which is the front-end state. And then from that front-end state, let's go. From that front-end state, you build the HTML. And do you remember the Web 1.0? This HTML is a projection of the state of the backend, but with a bit of bloat in between. You have 4 layers of state. You replace 1 layer of state by 4 layers of state. In some cases, it's useful. I didn't say that it's totally stupid to do state duplication. In some cases, it's really useful. But think twice. In many, many cases, it's just a pain in the ass for your own team. And I think a lot about the developer experience talk at the beginning of the afternoon. When we choose to add more complexity into our stack, we kill our own developer experience because you have more things to keep track. Okay, I have my PHP dependency, I have my front-end dependency, I have my build dependency, and oh, this doesn't work. Is it? No, is it? It's maybe, oh, is it this state? No, it's maybe this state. Oh, this state changed since yesterday. And it starts to be super hard to iterate on the project. And by the way, maintaining multiple state is definitively a cache problem, and I don't know for you, but every time I try to handle a cache problem, I can only have a partial solution. It's never, ever, ever the final solution. There is always edge case. And those edge cases will certainly pop up on production at some point. So as soon as you create a caching problem, you need to invest time to maintain this system. And this system, if it's valuable, okay, let's do it. If it's just because you have a heavy framework in the front end, maybe it should be challenged a little bit. And then the history tend to be cyclic. When React invent the server component, what did they try to solve? They try to solve the problem that they create. It's funny. It's not really innovation. It's trying to solve your own created problem. And basically, if in a React application you transform all your component to server component, did you really need React? For me, it's an open question. I think this talk is not about silver bullet or perfect solution. It's really about, can you question your choice? And can you see and understand if this complexity is needed or not for your project? So let's go back to Htmx. Htmx has this, can we resume as the UI is managed by the backend. So from the backend, you generate HTML. Htmx uses some additional attributes to configure what kind of interactivity and how this interactivity should work on the front end. In many cases, I think most of the simple cases, you don't even need to build anything for your front end. The features provided by the framework are enough to handle a lot of cases. So you don't have to maintain a build chain. And at least for me, it's a pleasure. It's a quite slim framework. Just a single JavaScript minimis. You can send it from anywhere. You don't have to build it. You can just download the build version from GitHub, and it's done. So Web 2.0 with Htmx look a bit like Web 1.0. Your backend start to be responsible of everything again. And it opened a lot of nice possibility. This is your source of truth, and basically the HTML that you send to the front end just contains some information, all the information needed to describe what kind of interactivity you want. So you have a strict separation. The backend is responsible for domain logic, business logic, like the risky logic, where you need fresh data to take decision. And the front end contains only some presentation logic. And if you have this strict separation, you don't have this, my front end is not trustable, because your front end didn't really manage any domain logic. You have your domain logic on the back end. Your validation is here. This is ready to be safe at some point. And this is the kind of code that you can have. So this is a simple button. The first attribute defines that if you click on it, it will trigger a post request to that URL. And the swap attribute say, what do you want to replace? And in this case, the old button will be replaced by the response sent by the server. And if you think about a lot of interaction that we can have in a lot of our project, that's what we do all the time. Just requesting a little piece of information and just changing part of the web page. Come on. This is a bit more complex. So this is a form. I have my target. So my target is outside of the form. So I can have the form and just the result that would be displayed somewhere else on the page. The trigger is a really nice thing. You can add a keyboard shortcut. Super easy. The post will be sent to the current page because it's empty, and it will swap the inner HTML of the response area data. And the Htmx allow you to load some extension. In this case, it's the debugging. And you will have all the stack of JavaScript event that Htmx trigger and all the debugging of the request with the backend. So it's pretty cool to have an overview of what happened when Htmx updates your page. This is another little example. So same thing, you have this HX post, you have a target. Indicator can, you have this span with the class Htmx indicator on top. It's a spinner. Just you have some activity on the search and you just want that this element appear when the search is active. And the trigger is again really interesting. You can configure a delay, but you can also configure throttling or reacting on the input or keyboard shortcut like we see on the previous slide. And all this is quite easy to read and covered lots of use cases. Like you can do autocomplete. The other example is really interesting. This is, let's say that this is the last row of a huge table that you have on a page. The triggers say revealed. So when your user will scroll down the table and reveal this last row, it will trigger a GET request to that contact page too, and it will just append the row inside the current table. That's it. So you have infinite loading for free. It integrates nicely with CSS for all the animation and transition API. Basically, before a request, it attaches a class to the current element. When it adds some new element, it attaches a class for a small moment. And you can just style your interaction or animation like you want. It has some advanced feature. WebSocket and SSO server-side event are accessible over an extension. And it's a pretty nice way to, I really like, especially server-side event, because I think it's pretty simple. And it's a common use case that you need to stream from your backend what is currently happening to all your client. Like this, the UI can just react. I don't know, I add a new person into the enterprise directory, and you have your browser open, and just that person just pop up quite easily, and it's super easy to integrate. There is some HTTP header to integrate with browser history. You can even trigger some JS event in the front end from the backend by sending an HTTP header. So you can go pretty far with still without any things built specifically for your front end. I see a lot of video on YouTube or some article around Htmx, and some of them say Htmx is the anti-JavaScript. And I think it's totally wrong. It's totally wrong. First, it's coded in JavaScript. Can be really against JavaScript when you use JavaScript. And it has a really beautiful API to integrate with JavaScript, with plain JS over JavaScript events. You can integrate with Alpine.js really easily, and I have an example here. Sometimes it's pretty useful to have, like, I don't know, an advanced state management for a component, and Alpine.js is a really slim, and it matched pretty nicely the philosophy of Htmx. And you can see that there is a few plugins for Htmx, and one is Alpine Morph. And this one is really interesting because if you replace the div with the target this with Htmx, Htmx will be smart enough to detect that that area of the page contains an Alpine.js component. It will save the state, replace the component, and reapply the state. So it will keep the state of your little component that is maybe a bit too complex to be handled just by Htmx. So you can leverage JavaScript just where you need it. And you can, by example, do a first iteration with a raw Htmx feature. I think you can go far away, but sometimes you have the feeling that it can be done a bit in a better way. So you can decide to live with the raw Htmx version and then come back later on and build a little Alpine.js component to just make that part of the application a little bit more shiny. This is an example of the JavaScript API to hook inside Htmx. And this one is just an authentication layer, totally dumb, but it show how you can integrate this. So it's really flexible. It didn't try to solve every world problem. Sometimes I think it's a huge symptom for bigger framework. They try to solve everything, but most of the time I don't need everything in my project. And yeah, future. I didn't go too much into the details about, there is a lot of other attributes that you can add to your HTML, but I think that talk will be quite boring if I just go through all the documentation. And the documentation of HTMX is like 10-page long. It should be like half an hour to go through all the HTML attribute that you have. So I think you can make it. Hyperview is another really interesting project, not totally connected to HTMX, but he reused the same HTML syntax. And the idea was to build native mobile application based on the same pattern. And they have some really nice demo. It's really interesting. And on the same kind of way of thinking, Phoenix, who is one big Elixir framework, web framework, released recently LiveView, who is basically HTMX for Phoenix, like really integrated into the framework. It's really badass. It's extremely badass. It's Elixir, so it has WebSocket from the ground up. And the last version that they release, you can deploy a new version of your application. And Elixir has a really nice feature that's hot code replacement. So you don't have to deploy a new server. You just replace your code that is currently running, and Elixir will just manage the transition. And at the end, it just call the front end to say, there's a new version deployed. Please update your CSS, update your script. And everything is magic. There is a video, it's just, it's amazing. What about Neos Fusion integration? I start a little prototype. It has some rough edges, actually. But I took inspiration from a Clojure project, who is named Simple Clojure. And I think Simple Clojure is really not too far away from how we build our Fusion tree. You can basically annotate a component to say, this component has an ID. And as the ID in HTML needs to be unique for the page, it can become an endpoint. You say, OK, I want this component with this ID available as an endpoint. And then you can use Htmx to just connect to that Fusion path and render just that part of the page. So that can make creating the needed endpoint on the backend easier. But there is a lot of exploration to do, and I didn't succeed to put enough effort to have something to really show, actually. But it's a really interesting subject. And one other thing, I didn't have an example for that, but it's also an interesting feature. If you take, by example, a page with a little form for, I don't know, subscription to a newsletter with pretty common things. And the client asks to have this form submission to be interactive without reloading all the page. You can do it quite quickly by fake it. with Htmx, you can say, okay, update this page, call the backend, and don't put the old body into the current body, but just select an element inside the page and just update it. So extract the form and update the form, but don't touch the rest. So it can be a first iteration to fulfill the client request, like your form is dynamic, but you don't have a specific endpoint on the backend. You just load the full page, it's cached on your CMS, so it should not be that expensive, and you just update the area that you need. Then, if the client asks to have a more complex form, like with a huge workflow, 5, 6, 7, 10 page, maybe it's time to create an endpoint on the backend and make something more complex. I read a few concerns about Htmx, and one of them is backend endpoint explosion. That's true. You will have more backend endpoints. But if you compare, when you create an HTTP endpoint to serve a certain specific feature of your front end for Htmx, if you do the same thing in React, the code that you have in this endpoint will end up somewhere into the front-end application. You will have that code, that transformation of content. So I don't think there is a lot more code, clearly a bit more HTTP endpoint than in a traditional way of development, front-end development. So that's it. It's for me, the product didn't have a huge traction actually. A lot of people speak about it. I think the documentation is quite easy to read. It can be nice to have more examples for a bit more advanced stuff. The most challenging part is to change the way we think. It's not like what we do on a daily basis. So we really need to think a tiny bit differently. And at the beginning, it creates a bit of friction. But I have the feeling we have 2 applications that we use internally that use Htmx. I have the feeling that I gain really better velocity. And my project is easy to think. The mapping of all the components that I need to build an application is really like smaller. Onboarding some new people on the project is also simpler. You just set up your backend and you are done. You don't have to download, compile some really thing. It's simple. It's not a silver bullet. This is just a tool. And really like that quote. I don't know if someone say that really, but it's resume correctly the things. Hammer is perfect for nail, but if you try to use a hammer for a screw, you are screwed. Didn't really work. So thank you. My intention when I prepared that talk was growing up your curiosity and your willingness to challenge what we think is the default choice. And if you start to think about this, I will be super happy. And if you have some feedback in the next few weeks about what kind of default choice you change in your company, and just feel free to send me an email. I will be super happy to see what do you change or what do you challenge actually. So thank you.
Thank you, Dominique.
My pleasure.
For this great talk. We also have some presents for you, even though I think you might have learned back in Canada how to harvest wild honey from wild bees somewhere hanging from the rocks.
I left that for the bear.
And some tea and honey for you.
Thank you.
And I got a few questions from the audience. Oh, they grow in time. So First question. HTML buttons doing only magic are highly non-accessible. Can this gracefully downgrade or rather do progressive enhancement? Can Htmx be combined with web components? Well, that's 2 questions.
That's 2 questions. The first one about progressive enhancement, yes. Because you just need to make your full HTML page working. If there is a form inside the page, and I submit the form, something should happen on your backend. You add Htmx on top, and it just avoids you to send the full request. You just do that on the background. But it's totally the perfect choice for progressive enhancement. And about web component, it's the same answer than for Alpine.js. It's just the perfect best friend to create some advanced component where you need more complexity or more complex feature that is maybe difficult to do with Htmx, with a raw Htmx. But one advice about this, don't throw web component or Alpine.js too fast. Really try to do it with Htmx. You will learn something, and you will discover that it's a bit more powerful than what we first think.
Okay. Does HX trigger work on all browsers across all keyboards? Because sometimes the key code might not be the same, and this way the HX trigger would be bloated, wouldn't it?
Oh, I don't have an answer for this one. You need to try.
Then how do you name the huge amount of backend endpoints? Is there a naming convention?
No, there is no naming convention. And you name it whatever you want. I was in the prototype I'm working on for Fusion. Basically, I use the URL of the current page with the ID of the HTML I want to render. That's a way to do it. You don't have collision, and it works pretty nicely. But you are completely free to organize your endpoint. And another thing that I didn't say about endpoint, most endpoint for Htmx will send HTML. You send the response ready to be displayed. You don't send JSON. You can send JSON if you really like JSON. But it's the preferred way is just to send the ready to be displayed HTML. Take care with the script tag.
I pick a last one for you, which also is not a question, but a comment. And it says, I want to live in the Canadian outback if it turns me into a guru like it apparently did with you. Dominique,
Oh, welcome.
thanks for being here.
Thank you.